Imagine a man who had it all: wealth, power, a name that echoed through skyscrapers, until a single rainy day unraveled everything he thought he knew. A mysterious boy, a hidden letter, and a past he couldn't outrun. What would you sacrifice to reclaim your honor? Stick around to find out in this journey of secrets and redemption. It's a story you won't want to miss. Hit that like button and subscribe now so you don't miss a single chapter. The rain fell in thin, relentless sheets, soaking through Nathan Caldwell's wool overcoat as he stood before the weathered gravestone. It was March in upstate New York, and the air carried a bite that matched the hollow ache in his chest. Eleanor's name stared back at him, etched in granite. Eleanor Caldwell, beloved wife, 1967-2010. 15 years had passed since he'd last been here. 15 years since he'd turned his back on her, on their life together, for the glittering promise of a Manhattan skyline he could call his own. Now, at 58, Nathan was the CEO of Caldwell Properties, a titan of real estate whose name adorned skyscrapers and headlines. But today, under this gray, unforgiving sky, he felt like nothing more than a man caught in a storm he couldn't control. The cemetery was quiet, save for the patter of rain on stone and the distant hum of a highway. Nathan's polished leather shoes sank slightly into the sodden earth, a stark contrast to the gleaming marble floors of his office tower. He hadn't come here out of love or nostalgia. No, it was a phone call 2 days ago that dragged him back. Reporter from the Post, voice slick with menace, hinting at a story about the wife Nathan Caldwell left behind. The threat hung over him like a guillotine. Pay up or watch his carefully curated reputation crumble. For a man who'd built his life on discipline and control, the idea of being exposed gnawed at his pride. So here he was, staring at Eleanor's grave, searching for answers he wasn't sure he wanted. The rain plastered his silver-streaked hair to his forehead, dripping into his eyes. It felt like a reprimand, each cold drop a reminder of the years he'd let slip by. Eleanor had been soft where he was hard, a painter who saw beauty in cracked sidewalks while he saw only profit in concrete and steel. Their marriage had started as a transaction, her family's old money, his ambition, but somewhere along the way she'd tried to make it real. He hadn't. He'd chosen boardrooms over her quiet pleas, deals over dinners, until she faded into the background of his life. When she died, he'd sent flowers and a check to the hospital, too busy to attend the funeral. Now, the weight of that choice pressed against his ribs, sharp and unyielding. "Chuko no mekong?" A small voice broke through the rain's murmur. Nathan froze, his breath catching. He turned to see a boy no more than 10, standing a few feet away, clutching a soggy bundle of white daisies. The child's dark hair clung to his face, but it was his eyes, deep blue, piercing Eleanor's eyes, that stopped Nathan cold. The boy spoke again, his English tinged with a faint accent Nathan couldn't place. "Do you remember her?" Nathan's throat tightened. He wanted to snap, to demand who this kid was and why he was here, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he straightened, forcing his voice to steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I remember what I don't deserve to," he said, the admission slipping out before he could stop it. His tone was clipped, controlled, the way he always spoke when cornered, whether by a rival in a boardroom or his own guilt. The boy tilted, his head studying him with an intensity that made Nathan's skin prickle. "Mi bao chu lan goi quan trong," he said softly. "She said you'd come." Then, without another word, he stepped forward, laid the daisies at the base of Eleanor's headstone, and turned to leave, his small figure disappearing into the mist like a ghost. Nathan stood rooted, rain pooling, in the creases of his coat. "She said you'd come." The words echoed, a quiet accusation he couldn't shake. Who was this boy? Why did he have Eleanor's eyes? Those eyes that once looked at Nathan with hope, then resignation, then nothing at all. His mind raced, but he clenched his fists, forcing the chaos down. Control was his armor, his shield against a world that demanded perfection. He wouldn't let it crack. Not here, not now. Yet something shifted inside him, a crack in the foundation he'd built his life upon. For years, he'd measured his worth in dollars and square footage, in the respect of men who feared him. But, standing here, soaked and alone, that worth felt hollow. The reporter's threat loomed, his past laid bare for the world to judge. But it wasn't the headlines that unnerved him now. It was the boy, those daisies, and the unspoken truth they carried. He glanced back at the grave, the daisies stark against the wet stone. Eleanor had loved them, he remembered. Simple flowers for a woman who'd never cared for the opulence he chased. He'd mocked her for it once, calling them weeds. She'd just smiled, that gentle curve of her lips he'd dismissed as weakness. Now, that smile haunted him, a mirror to the man he'd become. The rain slowed to a drizzle, but Nathan didn't move. He could return to his office, call his lawyers, bury the story with money and influence. It's what he'd always done. Control the narrative, protect the name. But the boy's words clung to him, a thread pulling at the edges of his pride. Who was he? A son of a friend? A distant relative? Or something more? Something Nathan had buried along with Eleanor all those years ago. He took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in his lungs. His instinct screamed to walk away, to let the past stay dead. But his feet wouldn't obey. For the first time in decades, Nathan Caldwell, the man who'd mastered every room he entered, felt the stir of something he couldn't name. Guilt, perhaps, or the faint flicker of a conscience he'd long silenced. "I'll find out who you are," he murmured, his voice steady despite the storm within. He turned from the grave, rain dripping from his coat, and walked back to his car. The decision wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, resolute. A step toward a truth he wasn't sure he could face, but he would face it, not with anger or force, but with the discipline that had defined him, and maybe, just maybe, with the honor he'd forgotten he once had. Nathan sat alone in his office, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered. The floor-to-ceiling windows of Caldwell Properties' Manhattan headquarters framed a skyline of steel and glass, a testament to his decades of discipline and ambition. But tonight, the view felt distant, muted by the fog rolling in from the harbor. The rain from the cemetery still clung to his thoughts, a cold thread tying him to that small boy and Eleanor's grave. His fingers rested on the edge of a crystal tumbler, the amber glow of bourbon untouched. Control was his creed, and he wouldn't let it slip, not even now, when his mind churned with questions he couldn't silence. He leaned back in the leather chair, its creak the only sound in the vast room. The office was a shrine to his success. Polished mahogany desk, shelves lined with awards, a single orchid in a sleek vase. A nod to elegance he'd cultivated to impress. Yet, as his gaze drifted to the fogged glass, it wasn't the present he saw. It was the past, flickering like an old film reel, pulling him back to a time when Eleanor had been more than a name on a headstone. The Hamptons, 20 years ago. Their house there had been a wedding gift from her father, a sprawling estate with white columns and a chandelier that glittered like a frozen waterfall. Nathan remembered the first night, standing in the grand foyer, his suit still crisp from ice. A board meeting while Eleanor moved barefoot across the hardwood, a paintbrush tucked behind her ear. She'd been beautiful in a way he hadn't understood then. Soft curves, dark hair spilling over her shoulders, and those blue eyes that saw through his armor. He'd married her for her family's name, a stepping stone to the elite circles. He craved. She'd married him, he realized too late, because she loved him. "An kong kan tien bakje chong minhan la ai," she'd said one evening, her voice gentle as she sat by the window, sketching the sunset over the dunes. The room smelled of turpentine and the lavender she grew in pots by the sill. Nathan had stood in the doorway, loosening his tie, exhaustion from a day of negotiations weighing on him. Her words stung, a quiet rebuke to the life he was building. "You don't understand," he'd replied, sharper than he meant. "I have to succeed. For us. For my father. Respect doesn't come free." She'd looked at him then, her brush pausing mid-stroke, and smiled, a sad, knowing curve of her lips. "It's not respect you're chasing, Nathan. It's fear." He'd turned away, dismissing her as naive. Eleanor was an artist, a dreamer who taught kids to paint in a crumbling community center while he brokered deals for millions. She didn't belong in his world, he told himself. But deep down, he knew it was he who didn't belong in hers. The memory shifted, pulling him to darker days. Eleanor's health had faltered, quietly at first, a cough she waved off, then fatigue that kept her in bed. She'd asked him to stay home, her voice barely above a whisper, as she lay under a quilt she'd sewn herself. Just one day, she'd pleaded, her hand reaching for his. But he'd had a merger to close, a rival to outmaneuver. "I'll be back tonight," he'd said, already halfway out the door. He hadn't come back. Not that night, not the next. When she died, alone in a hospital room, he'd been in Chicago, signing papers that made him a titan. The news came via a voicemail he didn't listen to until morning. Nathan's grip tightened on the tumbler, the bourbon trembling slightly. He'd buried her memory with work, with success, convincing himself that regret was a luxury he couldn't afford. But now that boy Ethan had unraveled it all. Those eyes, her eyes, had stared into him at the cemetery, stripping away the pride he'd worn like a second skin. Who was he? Why had Eleanor spoken of him? The questions gnawed, but Nathan forced them down, his jaw clenching. He was a man of order, not chaos. He wouldn't let this shake him. His gaze fell to the desk drawer, a faint instinct tugging at him. He opened it, pushing aside contracts and pens until his fingers brushed something soft. A small canvas, no bigger than a postcard. He pulled it out, his breath catching. It was Eleanor's work, a sketch of him standing by a crib, a child's tiny hand reaching up. The lines were delicate, her signature looping in the corner. He didn't remember this, had never seen it. A child. They'd never had one. Or had they? The thought hit him like a fist, but he steadied himself, setting the canvas down with deliberate calm. The bourbon stared back at him, tempting. He could drink, let it dull the edges of this unease. But that wasn't who he was. Nathan Caldwell didn't bend, not to liquor, not to guilt, not to the past. Yet the painting lingered in his peripheral vision, a quiet challenge to the man he'd become. Eleanor had seen something in him he'd refused to acknowledge, a father, a husband, a man beyond the titles and triumphs. He'd mocked her softness, her faith in him, but now it echoed in that boy's words. "She said you'd come." He stood, crossing to the window. The fog pressed against the glass, blurring the city into shadows. His reflection stared back, sharp suit, lined face, a king of his own making. But beneath it, he saw the man Eleanor had loved, the one he'd buried under ambition. For years he'd measured his worth in power, in the fear he inspired. Now, that worth felt like a lie. Nathan's office was a fortress of silence, the kind only wealth and power could command. The polished mahogany desk gleamed under the soft glow of a brass lamp, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, Manhattan buzzed 30 stories below, a symphony of horns and ambition. But up here, the thick glass muffled it all. He sat rigid in his chair, the small painting from Eleanor still clutched in his hand, its delicate lines burning into his memory, the child in the crib, the tender sketch of him as a father. It didn't make sense. Not yet. But the weight of it pressed against his chest, a quiet demand for answers he wasn't sure he could face. The phone on his desk buzzed, shattering the stillness. Nathan set the painting down, his movements deliberate, and picked up the receiver. "Caldwell," he said, his voice a steel blade, honed by years of control. On the other end, a man's voice slithered through, low, oily, the kind that thrived on secrets. "Mr. Caldwell, it's Tom Grayson from the Post. We're running a piece tomorrow. The Tycoon's Forgotten Wife. Care to comment before it hits the stands? Or maybe settle this quietly?" Nathan's jaw tightened, but his face remained a mask. He'd dealt with vultures like Grayson before, reporters who sniffed out weakness and sold it for a headline. "You've got nothing," he said evenly, though his pulse quickened. "Print what you want. It won't stick." Grayson chuckled, a sound that grated like sandpaper. Oh, we've got plenty. Hospital records, a widow's tears, and a little bird says there's more. Maybe a kid? Pay up or we dig deeper. The line went dead. Nathan set the phone down, his hand steady despite the storm brewing inside. A kid. The boy from the cemetery, Ethan, flashed in his mind, those blue eyes piercing through the rain. Could it be? He pushed the thought aside, refusing to let panic take root. Control was his lifeline, and he wouldn't let a cheap extortionist unravel it. But Grayson's threat lingered. A crack in the armor of his reputation. He needed proof, something to anchor him before the world turned his past into a circus. His eyes fell on a small wooden box tucked beneath a stack of financial reports. It was Eleanor's, a keepsake he'd brought from the Hamptons after her death and buried in his desk, unopened. He'd told himself it was sentiment, but now he saw it for what it was: cowardice. He pulled it free, the wood smooth under his fingers, its brass latch dulled by time. With a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, he opened it. Inside lay a single letter, folded neatly. Eleanor's, looping handwriting stark against the yellowed paper. Nathan's heart thudded as he unfolded it, the faint scent of lavender rising from the page, a ghost of her presence. The words hit him like a quiet thunderclap. Nathan, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I don't blame you. Not anymore. You always needed to control everything to prove yourself, but I couldn't let you control him. His name is Ethan. I gave him life through a gift of myself, a donor to a family who could love him when I couldn't stay. I knew you'd see a child as a threat to your name, your empire. You'd have made me end it. So I kept him secret, safe. He's 10 now, growing up with people who see him as more than a legacy. Don't look for him unless you're ready to be more than the man you are today. Eleanor. The letter slipped from his hands, landing on the desk with a soft thud. Ethan. Her son. Their son. In a way he hadn't imagined. Not a child born of betrayal, but a deliberate act of love and sacrifice, hidden from him because she knew his pride would destroy it. Nathan's chest tightened, a raw ache spreading through him. She'd been right. 15 years ago, he'd have seen a pregnancy as a scandal, a crack in the perfect facade he'd built. He'd have demanded she erase it, erase him, to protect the Caldwell name. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the letter's words searing into him. Eleanor hadn't just protected Ethan, she'd protected Nathan from himself, from the man who'd valued power over humanity. His fingers brushed the painting again, the crib now a cruel echo of what might have been. Shame crept in, but he forced it down, his breath steadying. He wouldn't crumble. Not now. Not when the truth demanded he rise to meet it. The door swung open and Gerald Pierce stepped in, his tailored suit as sharp as his smirk. Nathan's rival on the board, a man who'd clawed his way up by stepping on others, Gerald carried the air of someone who smelled blood. Rough day, Nathan, he drawled, leaning against the doorframe. Words out. Reporters circling, like sharks. You're slipping. Maybe it's time I take the reins. Nathan met his gaze, unflinching. Gerald's taunts were a blade meant to cut deep, but Nathan wouldn't give him the satisfaction. You'd like that, wouldn't you? He said, his voice calm, cutting. But this company's mine, Gerald. Dig all you want. Nothing's burying me. Gerald's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he shrugged and sauntered out, leaving the threat hanging in the air. Alone again, Nathan picked up the letter, folding it with care. Grayson's story could wait. Money could silence it if it came to that. But Ethan couldn't. Eleanor's words were a mirror, reflecting the man he'd been. Cold, calculating, blind to what mattered. And yet, they held a challenge. Be more than the man you are today. His pride screamed to ignore it, to lock the box and move on. But his self-respect, the quiet, battered core of it, wouldn't let him. He stood, slipping the letter into his pocket. Gerald, Grayson, the board. They could wait. Ethan couldn't. Nathan didn't know what he'd find, or if he'd even be welcome. But he'd go. Not out of anger, not out of fear, but because for once, he owed Eleanor the dignity of facing the truth. He stepped to the window, the city lights piercing the fog, and made his choice. The empire could tremble. He wouldn't. The drive from Manhattan to the outskirts of Yonkers took Nathan through a world he'd long left behind. The Prat. City's gleaming towers gave way to cracked asphalt and sagging power lines, the skyline shrinking in his rearview mirror. His Bentley purred along the narrow road, an intruder in this quiet stretch of suburbia where the air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke. The wooden box sat on the passenger seat, Eleanor's letter tucked inside, a silent passenger guiding him toward a truth he still couldn't fully grasp. Ethan, her son, a boy she'd hidden to shield him from the man Nathan had been. He pulled up to a modest house at the end of a gravel lane, its faded clapboard siding glowing faintly under a single porch light. The windows spilled a warm yellow into the dusk, a stark contrast to the cold elegance of his own life. Nathan cut the engine, his hands lingering on the steering wheel. For a moment he considered turning back to the boardroom, to the bourbon, to the safety of his control. But Eleanor's words burned in his pocket. Don't look for him unless you're ready. He wasn't sure he was, but he stepped out, anyway, the gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman in her late 50s, her graying hair pulled into a loose bun. She wore a sweater frayed at the cuffs and jeans dusted with flour, her arms crossed tight across her chest. Her eyes, sharp, unyielding, sized him up in an instant. "You're him," she said, her voice low but steady. "The man from the cemetery." Nathan straightened, meeting her gaze. "Nathan Caldwell," he said, his tone measured, the way he introduced himself to CEOs and senators. "I'm here about Ethan." Her expression didn't soften. "Mary," she replied curtly, "and you've got no business being here." She stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her, a barrier between him and whatever lay inside. Didn't flinch, though her words stung. "I need to see him," he said, keeping his voice even. "Eleanor. She left me a letter. I didn't know about him until now." Mary's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something. Anger, maybe pity, crossing her face. "Didn't know," she echoed, her tone biting. "Or didn't care. She told me about you, the husband who chose money over her. You think you can waltz in here after 10 years and claim him?" The accusation landed like a blow, but Nathan held his ground, his jaw tight. He could have snapped back, defended himself with the cold logic he wielded in boardrooms. Instead, he took a breath, the crisp air steadying him. "I'm not here to claim anyone," he said quietly. "I'm here because she wanted me to be. I owe her that much." Mary studied him, her silence heavy. Behind her, the door creaked open, and Ethan peeked out, his small frame dwarfed by the shadows of the house. Those blue eyes, Eleanor's eyes, locked onto Nathan, wide with curiosity and wariness. In his hands, he clutched a wooden box of colored pencils, their tips worn from use. The sight hit Nathan like a memory he didn't know he had. Eleanor sketching at the Hamptons, her fingers stained with charcoal. "Ethan, go inside," Mary said, her voice softening for the boy but hardening again as she turned back to Nathan. "You think your name means something here? It doesn't. He's not a prize to be won. He's my son, mine and Eleanor's, in every way that matters." Nathan's chest tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. He could see the strength in her, the kind Eleanor had, quiet, unshakable. "I don't doubt that," he said, his words careful, deliberate. "I'm not here to take him. I need to know him, to understand what she gave him, what I didn't." Mary's arms dropped slightly, her stance easing, though her eyes remained guarded. "You think you can fix 10 years with a visit?" she asked, her voice a mix of scorn and exhaustion. "You think your money buys you a place in his life?" "No," Nathan replied, his tone firm but not harsh. "It's not about money. It's about her, about honoring what she did. I've spent my life building things, controlling things, but I failed her. I won't fail him too, not if I can help it." The admission slipped out, raw and unpolished, a crack in the facade. he'd worn so long. He didn't look away, letting her see the truth in it. For a long moment, Mary said nothing, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Ethan hovered in the doorway, his pencils clutched tighter, watching. Finally, Mary sighed, a sound heavy with years of protecting what she loved. "You don't get to decide what he needs," she said, "but he deserves to know where he came from, if he wants to. One meeting, that's it. And if you hurt him, Nathan Caldwell, no amount of money will save you from me." Nathan nodded, a single controlled motion. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. He glanced past her to Ethan, who hadn't moved, his small face a mirror of Eleanor's. Curious, guarded, alive in a way Nathan hadn't been in years. The boy didn't smile, didn't speak, but his presence was enough to stir something deep in Nathan's core, a flicker of responsibility, of purpose he'd buried under ambition. Mary stepped aside, holding the door open just enough for him to see the warmth inside, the faint smell of coffee, a worn couch, a life built on love, not wealth. "Tomorrow," she said. "1 hour. Don't be late." Then she shut the door, leaving him in the glow of the porch light, alone with the weight of her words. Nathan stood there, the gravel cold beneath his feet. He could have pushed harder, demanded more, but that wasn't the man he wanted to be, not anymore. Mary's defiance, Ethan's quiet watchfulness, they were a test, a chance to prove he could rise above the pride that had defined him. He turned back to the car, the wooden box in his hands, Eleanor's letter a steady pulse against his heart. Tomorrow he'd face them, not as a tycoon, but as a man trying to reclaim the dignity he'd lost. The ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria shimmered with the weight of wealth, crystal chandeliers casting prisms across gilded walls, the clink of champagne flutes mingling with the low hum of power brokers in tuxedos. Nathan stood at the edge of the stage, his black suit impeccably tailored, a shield against the chaos he knew was coming. Tonight was Caldwell Properties' annual shareholders' meeting, a ritual of triumph he'd mastered over decades, but as he adjusted his cufflinks, the wooden box and Eleanor's letter sat heavy in his mind, a quiet anchor amidst the storm about to break. He'd spent the morning preparing, reviewing numbers, rehearsing his speech, steeling himself for the hour he'd promised Mary. Tomorrow he'd meet Ethan, face the boy whose existence had upended his world. But tonight, the vultures were circling closer. Tom Grayson's story had hit the stands that morning. The tycoon's secret shame, a wife abandoned, a child denied. The headline screamed from every newsstand, and whispers rippled through the room like a rising tide. Nathan felt the weight of 100 eyes, shareholders, rivals, reporters, all waiting for him to crack. The lights dimmed, and he stepped to the podium, the microphone amplifying the steady rhythm of his breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a blade of calm slicing through the tension. "Caldwell Properties stands stronger than ever. Our profits are up, our vision clear. Tonight, we celebrate resilience." The words were rote, polished, the kind that had won him loyalty and fear in equal measure. But as he spoke, the double doors at the back swung open, and a swarm of cameras flooded in, flashes popping like gunfire. A reporter shouted from the crowd, voice cutting through the applause. "Mr. Caldwell, what about the kid? Is he your bastard, son?" The room hushed, a collective intake of breath. Nathan's hands tightened on the podium, but his face remained stone, years of discipline holding him steady. He could feel Gerald Pierce's smirk from the front row, the man's polished veneer barely hiding his glee. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for, his fall, his disgrace. He leaned into the mic, his tone unwavering. "I assume you're referring to the article in the Post. Let me be clear. There's no scandal here, only a story twisted for profit." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but the reporter pressed on, undeterred. "So you deny it? Hospital records show your wife was dying while you were closing deals. And the boy, Ethan, right? Who is he?" Nathan's chest burned, the mention of Ethan slicing deeper than the rest. He could see Grayson in the back, scribbling notes, feeding off the chaos. Gerald stood now, his voice smooth as venom. "Nathan, this is a distraction we can't afford. The board's concerned. Step aside. Let someone steady take the helm." The room erupted, shareholders shouting over each other, cameras clicking furiously. It was a coup, orchestrated and public, meant to break him. For a moment, Nathan saw, himself as they did, a titan teetering, a man whose pride had built an empire now crumbling under gossip. He could lash out, call Gerald a snake, dismiss the reporters with the arrogance he'd wielded so well. But that wasn't the man Eleanor had believed in, the man she'd hoped he could become. He thought of her letter, her sacrifice, and Ethan's quiet gaze at the door. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about them. He raised a hand, silencing the room with a gesture so calm it startled even Gerald. The lights bore down, hot and unyielding, but Nathan stood tall, his voice steady as granite. "I won't deny Eleanor," he said, the name ringing clear. "She was my wife, and I failed her. Not because I didn't love her, but because I love this more." He gestured to the room, the opulence, the power. "She died while I chased what I thought mattered. That's my shame, not hers." The crowd stilled, caught off guard by the rawness in his words. He pressed on, unflinching. "As for Ethan, he's not a secret, not a scandal. He's her son, born of her choice, her strength. I didn't know him until now, but I won't let you turn him into a weapon against me. He's a child, not a headline." His eyes locked on Gerald's, a quiet fire burning beneath the calm. "This company is mine, built by my hands. If you want it, Gerald, you'll have to fight harder than this." A stunned silence followed, broken only by the faint whir of cameras. Gerald's smirk faded, his confidence shaken by Nathan's refusal to bend. The shareholders shifted, some nodding, others whispering, the tide uncertain. A woman in the back, gray-haired, a long-time investor, stood and clapped, slow and deliberate. Others joined, a ripple of respect cutting through the chaos. Nathan stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding, but his face composed. The reporters surged forward, shouting questions, but he walked through them, head high, their voices fading into static. Gerald called after him, "You're finished, Nathan." But the words lacked bite. Nathan didn't turn back. He'd faced the storm, not with fury, not with desperation, but with the dignity he'd forgotten he had. Outside, the night air hit him, cool and sharp, the city lights glinting off the wet pavement. His phone buzzed, Grayson again, no doubt, but he silenced it, slipping it into his pocket. The stock would dip tomorrow. The board might still turn. But for the first time, that didn't matter. He'd stood for something beyond himself. Beyond the empire. Eleanor's faith, Ethan's existence, they were worth more than the applause or the scorn. He climbed into his car, the leather cold against his back, and pulled the wooden box onto his lap. Tomorrow, he'd see Ethan, not as a tycoon proving a point, but as a man seeking a connection he'd lost. The lights of the Waldorf faded behind him, and Nathan drove into the night, steady, unbroken, a flicker of honor rekindled beneath the pressure. The small house on the gravel lane felt like a world apart from the Waldorf's gilded chaos. Nathan sat on a worn couch in Mary's living room, the faint scent of brewed coffee mingling with the musty warmth of old wood. Sunlight streamed through a cracked window, painting golden streaks across the hardwood floor where Ethan knelt, a wooden pencil box open beside him. The boy's dark hair fell into his eyes as he sketched on a scrap of paper, his small hands steady with purpose. Nathan watched, his breath shallow, the weight of last night's stand at the shareholders' meeting still humming in his veins. Mary lingered by the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, her gaze a quiet warning. She'd let him in, begrudgingly, after his promise to keep this simple, to respect the life she'd built for Ethan. 1 hour, she'd said at the door, her voice firm. He doesn't need your world crashing into his. Nathan had nodded, leaving his suit jacket in the car, rolling up his sleeves as if shedding the tycoon could make him less of a stranger. Now, sitting here, he felt the gulf between them, Years of absence, a legacy of neglect, and wondered if an hour could bridge it. Ethan didn't look up, his pencil scratching softly against the paper. Nathan cleared his throat, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow. "What are you drawing?" he asked, his tone gentle but steady, the way he'd once spoken to junior executives before he'd hardened. The boy paused, glancing at him with those piercing blue eyes. Eleanor's eyes. "A tree," he said simply, then returned to his work. Nathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, peering at the sketch. It was rough, but alive, gnarled branches reaching into a sky streaked with yellow. "It's good," he said, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Your mom, she used to draw like that." Ethan's hand stilled, his small frame tensing. "You knew her?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp, cutting through the room's stillness. Nathan nodded, a lump rising in his throat. "She was my wife," he said, the words heavy with a truth he'd avoided for too long. "A long time ago." Mary shifted, her shadow falling across the floor, but she didn't interrupt. Ethan set the pencil down, reaching into the pencil box. He pulled out a thin notebook, its edges frayed, and handed it to Nathan without a word. The cover was plain, marked only by Eleanor's looping script, "For Ethan." Nathan's fingers trembled as he opened it, the faint lavender scent of her rising again, a ghost in the pages. Her handwriting filled the lines, steady despite the years. "Ethan, my light," it began. "If you're reading this with him, he's found you. I loved Nathan once more than he knew, but he built walls I couldn't climb, walls of pride, of ambition. I got sick, and he couldn't stop to see it. I don't blame him anymore. I chose you, my gift to a family who'd cherish you when I couldn't. The doctors offered treatment, but it was costly, uncertain. I said no. Every dime I saved went to you, to your future, your colors, your dreams. He'll understand one day, I hope. Tell him I forgave him." Nathan's breath caught, the words a knife twisting in his chest. She'd refused treatment, not out of despair, but for Ethan, for a boy she'd never hold, a life she'd never see, the money she could have spent on herself, on a chance to live she'd poured into him instead. He closed his eyes, the notebook trembling in his hands, Eleanor's sacrifice crashing over him like a wave. He'd been in Chicago, signing deals, while she made that choice alone. He opened his eyes, meeting Ethan's gaze. The boy watched him, unblinking, a question in his silence. "She said you'd understand one day," Ethan said softly, echoing her words. "Did you?" Nathan's throat burned, but he kept his voice steady, his discipline a lifeline. "I'm starting to," he said, the admission raw, unguarded. "She was stronger than me, braver. I didn't see it then. I was too busy building something I thought mattered." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong." Ethan tilted his head, studying him, then picked up his pencil and resumed sketching. "She said you were good," he murmured, almost to himself. "But you weren't there." The word stung, simple and true, but Nathan didn't flinch. He could have defended himself, spun a tale of duty and necessity, but that would have been a lie. "No," he said quietly. "I wasn't. And I'll carry that every day. But I'm here now, if you'll let me be." Mary stepped forward, her arms uncrossing, her expression softening just a fraction. "He's not yours to fix," she said, her voice low but firm. "He's not a project." Nathan met her eyes, nodding once. "I know," he replied. "I don't want to fix him. I want to know him, to honor her." The room fell silent, the only sound Ethan's pencil moving across the page. Nathan set the notebook down, its weight a testament to Eleanor's love, a love he'd failed to match. He'd spent his life chasing respect, fearing weakness, but here in this modest room, he saw the truth. His pride had been a cage, locking him away from what mattered. Eleanor had broken free, giving everything for this boy, and now she'd handed Nathan the key. He stood, smoothing his shirt, his composure intact but softer, less rigid. "Thank you," he said to Mary, then glanced at Ethan. For letting me see this." The boy didn't look up, but his pencil slowed, a small acknowledgement. Mary nodded, a grudging acceptance in her eyes. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she warned. "I won't," Nathan said, meaning it. He stepped toward the door, the sunlight warm on his face as he opened it. The pencil box glinted by the window, a symbol of Eleanor's legacy, of her strength, her sacrifice. He'd been a fool, blind to it all, but not anymore. This wasn't redemption. Not yet. It was a beginning, a chance to be the man she'd believed he could be, one quiet step at a time. The boardroom of Caldwell Properties felt like a relic of a life Nathan no longer recognized. The long oak table stretched before him, its surface, polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the gray light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Dust motes danced in the air, a quiet testament to the days he'd been absent since the shareholders' meeting. The leather chair at the head, his chair, sat empty, a throne he'd once guarded with iron will. Now it loomed as a question. Who was he without it? He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, the city sprawling below in a haze of morning fog. Eleanor's notebook rested on the table, its frayed edges a stark contrast to the room's sterile opulence. Ethan's pencil sketch of a tree lay beside it, a gift from their hour together, a fragile bridge between the man he'd been and the one he was becoming. The memory of that small house, the scent of coffee, the scratch of Ethan's pencil, it anchored him, steadying, the storm that had followed his public stand. The door swung open, and Gerald Pierce strode in, his footsteps sharp against the hardwood. His suit was crisp, his silver hair slicked back, but the smirk on his face carried a brittleness Nathan hadn't noticed before. "Well, Nathan," Gerald said, his voice dripping with mock pity, "you've made quite the mess. Stock's down. 15%. Shareholders baying for blood. I told you you're finished." Nathan turned, meeting Gerald's gaze with a calm that belied the ache in his chest. He could feel the weight of the company, decades of deals, late nights, victories pressing against him. But it was lighter now, less a burden than a choice. "You're welcome to think that," he said evenly, his tone a blade wrapped in velvet. "But I'm still here." Gerald laughed, a harsh bark that echoed off the walls. "For how long? The board's calling an emergency vote tomorrow. They want you out, me in. And after that little stunt at the Waldorf, who can blame them? You've turned this into a soap opera." He stepped closer, his eyes glinting with triumph. "You threw it all away for a kid who doesn't even know you. Pathetic." The jab landed sharp and deliberate, but Nathan didn't flinch. He could have struck back, reminded Gerald of the deals he'd botched, the allies he'd alienated with his arrogance. Instead, he took a slow breath, the air cool against his lips, and let the insult pass through him. "You'd like that narrative, wouldn't you?" he said, his voice steady, unyielding. "But it's not about weakness, it's about what's right." Gerald's smirk faltered, a crack in his armor. "Right?" he scoffed, pacing to the table and tapping it with a manicured finger. "This isn't a charity, Nathan. It's a business, and you've lost it. Your edge, your control. Step aside, or I'll make sure the lawsuits bury you. Shareholders are already talking legal action." Nathan's hands tightened behind his back, but his face remained a mask of composure. He thought of Ethan, those blue eyes, that quiet strength, and Eleanor's words in the notebook. "Tell him I forgave him." Gerald's threats were real. The company could crumble, his legacy reduced to headlines and litigation. But the man he'd been, the one who'd crushed rivals to protect his name, felt distant now, a shadow he no longer needed. "I built this," Nathan said, his voice low but firm, gesturing to the room, the view, the empire. "Every brick, every dollar. But I built it on sand, on pride, on fear. I won't let it bury Ethan, too." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his gaze locking onto Gerald's. "You want it? Take it. But you'll have to do it without me breaking." Gerald's eyes narrowed, his confidence wavering. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier bite. "You'll regret this. Walking away from everything." "No," Nathan replied, a quiet conviction settling in his chest. I regret walking away from them, Eleanor, Ethan. That's what I carry. This? He nodded at the chair, the table, the glittering skyline. This is just a thing. I'll survive without it. He turned to the table, picking up the notebook and the sketch, their weight grounding him. Gerald watched, his silence a grudging acknowledgement of the shift between them. Nathan walked to a side cabinet, pulling out a folder, his shares, the last tether to Caldwell Properties. I'm selling, he said, sliding it across the table. Not to you, to a trust. For kids like Ethan, kids who need a chance. Call it the Eleanor Fund. Gerald's jaw dropped, a rare flicker of shock breaking his facade. You're insane, he sputtered. You're throwing millions away. For what? Some dead woman's dream? For her, Nathan said simply, and for him. That's enough. He stepped past Gerald, the man's protests fading into a hollow echo. The boardroom door closed behind him with a soft click, severing the thread to a life he'd outgrown. The Ajay. Elevator ride down was silent, the hum of machinery a steady pulse. His phone buzzed, calls from lawyers, board members, Grayson, but he let it ring, slipping it into his pocket. The lobby opened before him, marble floors gleaming under chandeliers, a world he'd once ruled. He walked through it, head high, the notebook and sketch in his hands like a compass. Outside, the fog had lifted, sunlight cutting through the city's haze. Nathan paused, the air sharp and clean against his face. Gerald might win tomorrow, might take the chair, the title, but it didn't matter. Nathan had lost the empire and found something greater, a purpose beyond himself, a dignity earned through sacrifice. He climbed into his car, the engine rumbling to life, and drove toward Yonkers, not as a tycoon, but as a man ready to keep a promise. One quiet choice at a time. The cemetery lay quiet under a late March sun, its rolling hills dappled with the first green of spring. Nathan knelt beside Eleanor's grave, the earth cool and damp beneath his knees, a trowel in his hand. Beside him, Ethan worked with a small spade, his dark hair catching the light as he dug a shallow hole for the daisies they'd brought. White petals trembling in the breeze, Eleanor's favorites. The gravestone stood weathered, but steady, her name a silent witness to the years Nathan had lost and the ones he was reclaiming. He wore a simple sweater now, the suits of his past left behind in a Manhattan closet he rarely visited. The Bentley had been traded for a modest sedan, the proceeds folded into the Eleanor Fund, a trust growing quietly, funding art programs for kids like Ethan across the city. Caldwell Properties was Gerald's now, the headlines proclaiming his triumph, but Nathan hadn't read them. The empire he'd built had slipped through his fingers, and yet, kneeling here, he felt richer than he ever had. Ethan hummed softly, a tune Nathan didn't recognize as he pressed soil around the daisy roots. The boy's hands were steady, purposeful, Eleanor's hands, alive in a way that still caught Nathan off guard. "Do you think she likes them?" Ethan asked, glancing up, his blue eyes bright with a question that held no doubt, only curiosity. Nathan paused, the trowel sinking into the dirt. "She does," he said, his voice low, but certain. "She always loved daisies. Said they were honest flowers." He smiled faintly, a memory flickering. Eleanor in their Hamptons garden, kneeling just like this, her laughter soft against the wind. He hadn't joined her then, too busy with calls and contracts. Now the simplicity of this moment felt like a gift he didn't deserve but wouldn't refuse. They worked in companionable silence, the sun climbing higher, warming the air with a promise of renewal. Since leaving the boardroom, Nathan had moved to a small house near Mary's, a place with creaking floors and a kitchen he was learning to navigate. The first morning he'd burned the toast, smoke billowing as Ethan giggled from the table. "You're bad at this," the boy had said. And Nathan had laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. It was a start, clumsy and real, a life built on moments instead of monuments. Mary had softened too, her wariness giving way to a grudging trust. She'd let Ethan visit more often, their hours stretching into afternoons of drawing and quiet. talks. Nathan didn't push, didn't demand. He let it grow, a fragile thread strengthening with time. He'd learned to brew coffee the way she liked it, strong and black, a small peace offering left on her porch some mornings. She never said thank you, but the empty mugs returned clean, a silent acknowledgement. Ethan sat back on his heels, brushing dirt from his hands. "Do you think Mom's proud of us?" he asked, his voice small but steady, cutting through the stillness. Nathan set the trowel down, turning to face him fully. The question hung between them, simple and profound, a mirror to the man he'd become. "I think she is," he said, his tone warm, unshaken. "She always saw the best in people, even me when I didn't deserve it. She'd be proud of you, your drawings, your heart. And me?" He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "She'd be glad I'm here, trying to be the man she believed I could be." Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded sketch, a family under a tree. 3 figures this time: Eleanor, Ethan, and Nathan. Rough, but clear. "I drew this for her," he said, laying it against the gravestone, a pebble anchoring it in the breeze. Nathan's chest tightened, the image a quiet absolution he hadn't sought but felt all the same. He stood, offering a hand to Ethan, who took it with a trust that still humbled him. They stepped back, the daisies a bright cluster against the gray stone, a testament to what Eleanor had given them both. Nathan thought of her notebook, her sacrifice, refusing treatment to secure Ethan's future. He'd carried that weight since the day he'd read it, not as guilt now, but as a call to live better, to honor her with more than words. The city loomed in the distance, its towers faint against the horizon. Caldwell Properties thrived under Gerald, or so the paper said, but Nathan didn't care. The Eleanor Fund had opened its first art center last week, a brick building in the Bronx where kids laughed over paintbrushes and pencils. He'd been there, sleeves rolled up, pouring coffee for volunteers, watching Ethan show a girl how to shade a leaf. It wasn't a skyscraper, but it was hers and his, a legacy of love instead of power. "Do you miss it?" Ethan asked, suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. "The big office, the fancy stuff?" Nathan looked down at him, the boy's face open, unguarded. "Sometimes," he admitted, honest but calm. "It was who I was for a long time. But this is better. You, Mary, this place. It's real." Ethan grinned, a rare flash of the light, and ran ahead, chasing a butterfly through the grass. Nathan watched him, the ache of years easing into something softer, steadier. He knelt once more, brushing his fingers over Eleanor's name. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice a whisper against the wind. "For him. For this chance." He stood, the sun warm on his face, and followed Ethan. His steps, sure, unhurried. The daisies swayed gently, a quiet promise kept. Nathan Caldwell was no longer a tycoon, no longer a name in lights. He was a man, flawed, growing, present. And as Ethan's laughter echoed across the hill, he knew that was enough. Dignity wasn't in the empire he'd lost, but in the family he'd found, the honor he'd earned one daisy at a time. And so, beneath the quiet of a spring day, a man once defined by power found peace in the smallest acts of love. A daisy planted, a promise kept. It's a reminder that true dignity isn't in what we build, but in what we give. What did you think of his journey? Drop a comment below, hit that like button if it moved you, and subscribe to join us for more stories that stir the heart and soul, because there's so much more to come.